Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 8th BEREC Stakeholder Forum meeting. This year, we won't be able to meet in person. There will be no drink at 5, but still an extremely interesting program for this afternoon put together by BEREC. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, the Commissioner Thierry Breton, who recorded a message for us. Thierry Breton, as you know, is the Commissioner for the Internal Market, and he's looking over almost all the topics of interest to the audience this afternoon. So please, the floor is for Thierry Breton.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am glad that despite the difficult circumstances of this period, so many of you are participating in this very important event. At the same time, these difficult circumstances have made us all realize how dependent we are on good, secure, and resilient connectivity. Let me start from connectivity. The European Union remained resilient and connected during the crisis, and this is also thanks to the effort by many of you. However, there is no room for complacency. As long as all parts of our society are excluded from fast broadband connections, we just cannot be satisfied. We now have a unique window of opportunity. The new Recovery and Resilience Facility will provide large-scale financial support to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and to relaunch our economies through key investment in green and digital technologies. 20% of the funds will have to be invested in digital priorities. This is the moment to invest in those key flagship initiatives, which are at the heart of the European digital sovereignty. And when we speak of sovereignty, or strategic autonomy or resilience, we are not talking about isolating ourselves from the world, but just having choice, alternatives, fair competition, avoiding unwanted dependencies, both economically and geopolitically. Connectivity together with data and microelectronics are the cornerstones of our digital sovereignty. They will act as an enabler for many other critical digital technologies we need to invest in, such as artificial intelligence, supercomputers, and processors. What we need to do is very clear. Accelerate fiber deployment, ensure fast and secure rollout of 5G networks, and prepare for 6G already. And in addition, ensure coverage for everyone and secure communication through a constellation of low-orbit satellites. These investments take place against the backdrop of our electronic communication code, a modern regulatory framework promoting high-quality connectivity and access to very high-capacity networks by everyone. Since years, the Commission and BEREC have been working together to ensure that the application of our legislation promotes competition and investment, strengthens the internal market, empowers and protects end users, and promotes connectivity in Europe. I would like to thank BEREC for its very important contribution to these objectives. However, to mobilize investment, we also need an efficient system. Current fragmentation in Europe is holding back our collective potential and promoting inefficient business models based on national markets. Fragmentation and high spectrum cost for EU operators have consequences. We need to unify more our European markets. And it is time to encourage consolidation and create a real internal market for telecommunication services. Let me add a few remarks on another very important aspect of our digital sovereignty, to which part of this event is also devoted. I am referring to the issue of digital platform regulation. We are preparing an ambitious proposal for a Digital Service Act and have received almost 3,000 contributions to our reflections in the recent public consultation. And I would like to thank BEREC here again and the national regulatory authorities for the very interesting and important contributions submitted. Digital services have evolved since the adoption of the e-commerce directive in 2000, and so has the scale of their use as well as users' behavior online. Certain platforms have become systemic to our economy, society, and even democracy. At the time of the financial crisis, we used to say that certain banks had become too big to fail. Today, certain online platforms have become systemic also, and maybe too big to care. A new banking regulation was the answer to too big to fail. Before the end of the year, I want to give our answer to too big to care. The two proposals I will present under the Digital Service Act will be the new rulebook for digital services at the heart of the regulatory backbone of our digital sovereignty. My plan is to have a horizontal regulation modernizing the e-commerce directive, accompanied by specific instruments to correct problems in the digital markets characterized by the presence of few very powerful gatekeepers. For all digital services, we are considering a system based on due diligence, calibrated on the type and size of the service. For gatekeepers, in addition, we are considering much stricter obligations. Let me be clear on this. Big online platforms are global, conglomerate, and diversified ecosystem. They involve public interests beyond economic and competition considerations. There are certain similarities with the telecoms world you know so well, but also various differences. I derive from these two implications. First, we need to think out of the box to strengthen the governance and enforcement system for the future rules for the platform economy. This is why I'm thinking of a multi-layered system involving authorities in all member states as well as the Commission. Second, since digital markets are fast-moving, we cannot limit ourselves just to some predefined obligations for gatekeepers. We need also a flexible way to investigate how these markets evolve and draw the consequences, and maybe update the predefined obligations. In a few weeks, when I present our proposals, you will see how these reflections have been translated into concrete provisions. I leave these few thoughts with you, and I would like to wish you all the best for your discussions during the rest of this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Breton, for these words of introduction. I'm sure we will go back to many of the topics that you raised in this introduction during the rest of the afternoon, in particular the DSA. And the second part of this afternoon is dedicated to a presentation and a roundtable on the DSA. I'm delighted to introduce now Michel van Bellinghen, the chairman of the Belgian regulator and incoming chair 2021 for BEREC. Michel, over to you for the presentation of Work Program 2021. 2020 was a very busy year for BEREC. I was hoping that 2021 would be a bit lighter, but when I saw the program, you know, it's amazing what you're going to achieve next year. Huh?
Thank you very much, Philippe. Yes, can I have the slide presentation, please? Thank you very much for that. So, good afternoon, everyone. And yes, after this very enlightening and inspiring introductory remarks, it is now my pleasure as the incoming BEREC Chair 2021 to guide you through the draft work program for the upcoming year. 2020 was very loaded indeed, and as you will see, 2021 as well. So I'm convinced that this online stakeholder forum is a good opportunity for stakeholders to interact with BEREC. And again, given the exceptional circumstances we have now to meet virtually, but let's hope that we will meet in real life in Brussels again next year in April. So the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So let me give you an overview of the process and the timing of this draft work program. First of all, as requested by the BEREC regulation, we adopted and published a first outline of the draft work program at the end of January. And on the 10th of March, we launched an early call for inputs. On the 6th of October, we launched a public consultation on this draft work program. Today, we are having this stakeholder forum where we are interested in hearing your thoughts about this draft. And we are also looking to your reactions on this via the public consultation which will run until the 5th of November, as you probably know. Finally, we will publish the final work program on the 15th of December. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as you can see, this is the structure of the draft work program, which follows the objectives of BEREC's work for 2021, and which is also aligned with the BEREC strategy 2021-2025. This means that in 2021, we will obviously focus on the three high-level strategic priorities you can see on the screen, but other priorities also set for institutional and international cooperation. And as you know, we have also the BEREC obligatory and EU mandatory work. And finally, the stakeholder engagement and suggestion for the work program in 2022. We will discuss this more in detail in a moment. Next slide, please. So, thank you. What are our important horizontal priorities? So BEREC's activities have mainly been focused on meeting its obligations under the code by developing guidelines this year. And in 2021, much of BEREC's work will shift from issuing guidelines towards assessing future technological and market developments, especially related to end users' provisions within the scope of electronic communications and the digital ecosystem. The facilitation of successful implementation, the consistent application of the code, and the focus on sustainability will be important horizontal principles that remain high in the radar of our overall work. And looking beyond our own work items we put forward, we also observe that 2021 will become a loaded year for the European institutions, especially in the field of electronic communications and digital policy. As you know, the Commission is currently preparing several new legislative initiatives, like the Digital Services Act, as Commissioner Breton mentioned it, but also the Green Deal. And the Commission is also reviewing a high number of legislative instruments: the roaming regulation, broadband cost reduction directive, access recommendation on 5G, and a nice directive, for instance. So for that, BEREC stands ready to provide its independent advice to the co-legislators and the Commission based on our long-standing experience in the sector of electronic communications and ex-ante regulation. We plan to issue an opinion regarding the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, the review of the access recommendation, and to provide input regarding the review of the roaming regulation and the potential review of the EU state aid guidelines as required. We will also stand ready to support the Commission, ENISA, and the NIS Cooperation Group on security issues related to electronic communications networks. Indeed, promoting deeper collaboration both internally as well as externally will be increasingly valuable and necessary, especially in the context of regulatory issues with a horizontal impact related to, for instance, the internet value chain, the development of 5G, network security, and adapting competition rules to a digital platform economy. To that end, we envisage to develop a mid-term strategy for relations with other institutions. These are important horizontal principles in the draft work program 21. And in addition to this, we will of course focus on the 3 high-level priorities aligned with the BEREC strategy. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Okay, the first priority is promoting full connectivity. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has made us all recognize the absolutely crucial aspect of communications networks, is a stark reminder of the necessity of digital connectivity. Our electronic communications network have been put to the test through compulsory teleworking and e-learning, but they stood their ground. In 2021, BEREC will evaluate the measures of the NRAs and other market players taken during the pandemic to identify the steps needed to strengthen Europe's digital capabilities and increase the resilience of the electronic communications market for dealing with situations such as the COVID-19 crisis. And given the importance, the strategic importance of 5G for the open market, it is obvious for BEREC and the NRAs to put 5G at the forefront of our agenda. Now that more and more countries in Europe have auctioned 5G spectrum bands, followed by the rollout of 5G networks and the launch of 5G services, our work will be increasingly focused on actual 5G services availability and network infrastructure deployment by operators. And for that, there is a high demand for learning from each other, exchanging best practices, and building the right set of coverage indicators in order to ensure an adequate rollout of 5G networks across the European Union and better inform end users. BEREC considers that it would be timely to start internal discussions in cooperation with the IRSPG on practices that would allow NRAs and other competent authorities to monitor the rollout of 5G networks and eventually to inform end users on the availability of 5G networks and services. The rollout of 5G and fiber depends strongly on surface, but equally essential aspects such as the backhaul or the migration from copper to fiber. So, in order to foster the advent of 5G and fiber, these aspects also require attention. BEREC will scrutinize the application of the backhaul by NRAs. While reviewing the current practices, it will assess the need for preparing a common position on the regulatory treatment of backhaul. We will also issue a report aiming to develop a consistent approach to migration of and copper switch off based on a detailed data collection. And lastly, we will deliver a report issuing recommendation to enable comparable national broadband coverage indicators throughout Europe. So on the next column, please. Yes, thank you very much. This is the second priority, which is thriving, sustainable, and open digital markets. So regarding open digital markets, BEREC must track developments in the electronic communication sector and related sector. To do this, we must continue to develop our expertise in digital platform regulation. We aim to get a good understanding of the impact that new technologies have on the market dynamics and business models to be able to coordinate the implementation of appropriate regulatory measures. And stemming from the open internet regulation, BEREC will continue to monitor the implementation of the open internet provisions amongst NRAs. Regarding sustainability, in 2021, BEREC will implement ways of achieving more efficient meetings and sustainable resource efficient solutions by maximizing the potential of virtual meetings, building further on lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis. But in addition to that, we will work on the issue of sustainability for the ICT-related parts of the upcoming Green Deal and the Agenda 2030 targets. It is important for BEREC and its members to share best practices, but also to position itself as a trusted third party with the EU institutions. So next pillar, please. Next column. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me now come to our third important priority, empowering end users. We recognize the need to get a better understanding of digital platforms and consumers' view on digital platforms, and of the platform's role as provider and distributors of digital services. In this slide, we will envisage publishing a study that provides BEREC and NRAs with an evidence-based understanding of the interaction between consumers and digital platforms. We will also perform the first monitoring exercise of technological and market developments in the use of the different types of electronic communications services, and we will analyze their impact on the implication on the end users' rights. BEREC will produce two reports benchmarking the evolution of prices and volumes of international roaming communications as well as intra-EEA communications. And we will provide one report on transparency and comparability of international roaming tariffs. So, what about the cooperation with EU institutions and institutional groups? In addition to these three strategic priorities, next column please, BEREC has an overarching objective to strive towards engaging cooperatively and effectively with its stakeholders, in particular by exploring how collaboration can be strengthened with other European institutions so that we are ready to tackle future challenges. So this is the last slide for me on the presentation on this draft work program 2021. I've already mentioned the public consultation is out there, and we really hope to receive your comments before the 5th of November so we can take them into account before our plenary meeting in December. With that, I hand over the floor to Philippe. Back to you, Philippe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michel, and bon courage for this busy year 2021. You're going to have a lot of work. After Dan's presentation in a minute, we will have a Q&A where the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions to Michel, to Dan, and to Annemarie. We'll see to that in a minute. Some of you were kind enough to send a question in advance, and they've been prepared and formatted. You will see them. Be aware that you can still at this stage add further questions through the chat box, but please keep them short and to the point. I think I'm told there is a technical restriction of 250 characters. So just keep it short and to the point, okay? Thank you very much. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dan Sjoblom, who is Director General of PTS and the current BEREC 2020 Chair. And Dan, you will speak to us about the COVID-19 crisis and give us a perspective on this crisis. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Philippe. Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, stakeholders, whoever you are. Of course, talking about a topic like COVID-19, you have to start by realizing that this is a horrific challenge everywhere, and there are many who have been personally and with friends and family very badly hit by this virus. So when we talk about the impact it has had on the sector or on BEREC in particular, we shouldn't forget the bigger picture, I think. So when we set into 2020, the chairmanship year for me, for PTS, we were, of course, prepared to travel extensively, to meet with many of you stakeholders in different places. And as it turned out, I think first week of March was my last trip to Brussels, and since then I have been grounded in Stockholm. Like most everyone else, we have changed our habits a lot this year. So one thing didn't happen, the traveling part didn't happen, the personal interaction was changed into this format that we're using now. On the other hand, I must say that we did meet a lot of stakeholders, we did have a lot of events, and we did reach out, and sometimes we could see that participation to the events were really big compared to past years' experience in terms of number of participants, and also it was a little bit of a more democratic way of meeting stakeholders at some events, like the debriefings from our plenaries. We could see that there were many faces who didn't participate when we had live events in Brussels, and they were spread over a bigger geographic area and a wider circle of sectors. So there have definitely been good things as well as bad things over the year. Also for us, sharing the organization this year, we've had to shift a little bit focus into learning new skills, new functionalities, managing change. What does this new way of working mean for all of us? And not least ourselves taking big steps in terms of learning new digital skills. Many of these things, I think, have strengthened us, and I think will carry with us even in the future when hopefully we are freer to make choices apart from the government recommendations that we are now adhering to. Now on new tasks, I think the most visible task has been that BEREC very early in March was given the task by the European Commission to monitor the functionality of the internet when we almost overnight changed our production from office to home in many places. Many schools changed from learning in school to away from school or in home learning. And this, of course, could have had quite a difficult period if the internet didn't support the transition. So that's the background why BEREC was asked to provide this monitoring. In the first weeks, we actually did 2 monitoring reports every week. And then as we noticed that things worked relatively well, we have now reduced them down to a monthly basis with versions in between of weekly and bi-weekly. Because we have actually seen that there were big surges in internet use, as could be predicted, but that our internet infrastructure in Europe is very strong, and it has been able to cope essentially with the increased load caused by all of these people working and studying and doing everything much more from home, and shifting to daytime use rather than evening use in the home space. So I would like to say here to everyone from the sector who is participating, well done. I mean, without your work, this pandemic year would have been so much harder for everyone. So thank you very much for that. And beyond monitoring the speed and the functionality of internet, we have also done a little bit of work. We started receiving and asked for reports about different tracing apps produced by member states and developed by various players. This is an area, I think, where we will do a little bit more work in the coming weeks and months. It's interesting to note the different approaches taking in different member states. It's also interesting to see different uptakes, and how it would be interesting to see what has worked well, what has worked across borders and so on, to just learn from the experience. So we will see what we can do there. We're interested if there are stakeholders who already have experiences from tracing apps and more sort of can share reports with us, that would be of interest. I'd like to say a few other things about COVID-related changes, if you like, affecting and stressing the importance of electronic communication from this year's experience. Of course, you all know that we have new habits. We use more e-commerce, we remote work. Everyone knows a lot more about Zoom, WebEx meetings, and so on than we did. E-learning and less travel. So how is this going to develop post-pandemic, if there is such a word in sight? I think it's very likely that all of these tools I mentioned and the ways of working we've learned is going to become a part of our normal working lives, and it's going to be complementing the physical meetings rather than replacing it, I think. We see already, I think many of us in government services, we are very reliant on other government services recommendations. If the recommendation is for working from home, if you can, like it is in our case, we do so. We will, in my own organization, we have already said that at least this year to the end, we're going to work home. And I think we're hearing that it might indeed be longer, but we're seeing many examples also in the news about global companies taking the experiences further and not necessarily reflecting on the health authorities, but finding advantages in more remote working policies and enabling people to work away from the office on a more permanent basis. I think this is a trend that we're going to continue to see. Another interesting thing to look at might be the stock markets. I'm not a stock market expert, but I think it was a little bit surprising to many of us how quickly stock markets rebounded from the initial shocks. And it's also, of course, very interesting to see that the driver of the stock market recovery has largely been in the tech sector that we interact with a lot in BEREC. Of course, some of this comes from the member state and the EU stimulus packages, and the indication that from the EU that member states should include at least 20% of the stimulus packages in digital measures, which will provide a lot of good starting places for development of the sector into the targets that Michel mentioned in the work program. I'd like to say also a few words about the view from inside BEREC. I mentioned that we have had to reset and rethink some of our processes. We held actually quite recently an internal workshop discussing how this pandemic experience should impact our future work, and I think everyone agrees that there is no going back, even inside BEREC, to the pre-pandemic schedules. We think that we will need both digital and real-life meetings, including with you stakeholders, and I think there might well be more meetings going forward. It's easier to arrange relatively short meetings, topical meetings. So that's one possible development, but I think also in terms of our big meetings, those of you who know BEREC well, you know that we have traditionally 4 times a year, we have preparatory contact network meetings, and then we have the big plenary meetings where we take all the important decisions. We have found ways of dealing with the business end of that, adopting the decisions very well this year without meeting, but we do miss the networking, the opportunity to share experiences, and I think we will see development where we find other ways of interacting both inside the network and with your stakeholders going forward. I'm closing soon. If anyone is worried about time, I want to just say the obvious, that we have talked about a digital divide for a long time. I think this year has really shown what the digital divide can be when everything is moved into the digital space. If you're not inside the space where everything happens, you really have problems. So that provides even more reason for us to continue to work as a main theme with connectivity, with good connectivity, and with different types of connectivity. I think Michel mentioned that as one of our focus areas. And of course it should be, as also the EU Commission has put digital agenda on the top of the list of priorities going forward. So that's I think an obvious conclusion. I think we will also continue to work, as Michel mentioned, on the uptake and deployment of 5G, and the Digital Services Act comes indeed very timely. So I am not as surprised as Philippe mentioned that 2021 will be a very busy year for BEREC. And I also look forward to the input from our stakeholders on the draft work program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan, for sharing those thoughts with us. And time-wise, we're doing very well because Commissioner Breton kept it short and to the point. So I'm now delighted to open the Q&A session. And for this, we will have 3 very qualified personalities to answer your question from the audience. Michel and Dan, whom you met already, and Annemarie Sipkes, who is a director at ACM, the Dutch regulator, and also BEREC Chair 2022. Welcome, Annemarie.
Thank you.
So as I explained, because of the format, this particular format this year, we will only be able to handle question in written form through the chat box. Those of you who were kind enough to answer BEREC's call for question to be sent in advance, you may not recognize exactly your question because someone had to shrink them to fit the maximum of 250 characters. But hopefully the heart of your question is still there. Perhaps the statement that you wanted to make with your question has disappeared, but the question is still there. So I will now ask Quentin to show the first question, which comes from BIPT, the consumers. And well, I think that from reading the beginning of the question, I guess it's a question for you, Annemarie.
Yes, I see, Philippe. Thank you. I think that as Dan and Michel have already mentioned, that consumer protection is really at the heart of the things that we do in BEREC. The importance of connectivity, the downsides of the digital divide have been made very clear to us this last year due to the COVID lockdowns that we have experienced. So I think that the work that we are undertaking this year, next year, and probably also in 2022 will be very much in connecting people, in improving connectivity, in fostering innovation, to help consumers, to help citizens, to help students, to help family members, to help businesses to connect. So what these themes I think are also very important going forward into 2022. And I do look forward to engaging very early on with stakeholders on how to take these themes into concrete priorities on the agenda for 22. But I think that first we have a lot of work and a lot of good and important work to do in 21 that I'm looking really forward to.
Thank you very much, Annemarie. Quentin, please send the next questions, unless Dan or Michel wishes to add something on the consumer protection front. No, that was clear. The next question is from GSMA and is pertaining to 5G, of course. And there, the question is, what is BEREC seeking to achieve with its upcoming report 2021? And does BEREC plans to revise its 5G radar in the long run? Who wants to? Michel, you want to tackle that one?
Yes, thank you very much, Philippe. And I will start with the second question, and the answer is yes, because the 5G radar is BEREC's general overview for anticipating the pace of innovation, but this is just a first step, a rolling document, an ongoing work. So each map developments need more detailing as innovative 5G services develop. Therefore, updates and revisions seems inevitable. So back to the first question. In 2021, BEREC will issue a report that will contain lessons learned from the workshop with stakeholders in Q1 or Q2 2021. This report could provide either a high-level overview of details regarding specific verticals. An outcome could include a monitoring mechanism to keep up with development in the markets. And in the meanwhile, we, BEREC, and the regulators keep exchanging information. Next year, we will continue to talk with each other and to have internal discussions on how to monitor the rollout of 5G networks. For instance, which metrics and coverage indicators should be used and how to inform end users about the availability of 5G services in geographic areas. This kind of questions, we will try to address, and we will also continue learning about how to deal with this issue of EMF. Over to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Michel. Quentin, next question, please. This is a question from Metno. So, it's about the evolving role of BEREC. I'm interested in that answer. I mean, BEREC is since its inception dealing with telecom, but now we see a debate on DSA. I think recently there has been some work undertaken on sustainability. So, this is basically an empire in expansion, it seems. And how does How will regulators support new political priorities to increase? Oh, that's another one on digital leadership, a theme that Commissioner Breton alluded to, and this rather emerging theme of digital leadership, strategic autonomy. What is the role for regulators in this space? Annemarie, do you want to? It's a long-term
Yes.
project, so it should be the 2022 chair who handles it. I think.
It is. It is. And actually, the use of the word traditional regulation, I think, doesn't do justice maybe to the fact that I think that in telecoms, we have seen that all the things that are described, so as the advent of the digitization, the digital ecosystems arising, are all based on good connectivity. And I think that as we see that the telecom sector is moving into new worlds and into new business models and making all these digital business models possible, and they evolve, and so we as regulators evolve with them. And I think that our present experience with regulation and the things that we have learned in our various jurisdictions, as well as in the network that BEREC is, the learning network, I think we are very ready to help and assist, making sure that we reap all the profits and that we minimize the risks. And I think that if you look at the opinion that BEREC has produced vis-a-vis the DSA that Commissioner Breton already mentioned, that we see that the experience that we have gained over the years can also be very, very viable and very useful in the challenges that lie ahead. So I do think that as the sector evolves, we as regulators evolve as well, and that we also know that the connectivity as well as innovation and accessibility also thrive with stability and lessons learned. And I think that from those experiences, we will continue way into 2022 and beyond, probably, to help Europe face these challenges as well. And maybe one last remark on the sustainability. Of course, the COVID is a very urgent crisis, as Dan mentioned. But the sustainability issue is, of course, also something on a very long-term agenda. And I think that it is very appropriate that it's also on our agenda, and that we will increasingly do work on that theme as well.
Thank you very much, Annemarie. Quentin, or would Michel or Dan wish to add something on the previous question? No. The next question is from ECTA, and I think rather to the point, I would say. So BEREC work program foresees opinions on 3 really key files: the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, the State Aid Guidelines, and the review of the access recommendation. I mean, needless to say that these are 3 strategic questions. And the question asked by ECTA is, why is BEREC not foreseeing a public consultation on that? Good question. So who wants to? Michel, do you want it? Will fall in your remit next year. So.
It's okay. Thank you. I will take the question. Thank you very much, Philippe. And indeed, that's a good question too. And my answer is rather straightforward. You know that our general rule is that when BEREC publishes a document, we consult the document unless we have justified reason not to consult the sector. But as for these 3 opinions referred in the question, we will, of course, issue on the legislative work of the Commission. The only reason why we cannot consult the sector is just related to time constraints. As happened recently with the opinion on the list of the relevant markets and the euro rates that we published only last week, BEREC had only very, very few time to bring all the NRAs around the table and to come to a joint position. Hence, consultation procedure which should last 1 month as procedure prescribed, is simply not possible. And the same will apply in 2021, I'm afraid. So BEREC will have to deliver these opinions with very little time available between we get the draft from the Commission and the moment they need our feedback. Having said that, we have, of course, the possibility to meet with stakeholders. We are available to listen to the main concerns of the sector by having meeting or reacting and by reading their first reaction. Thank you, Philippe. Over to you.
Thank you, Michel, for that clear answer. Next, Dan wishes to add something. Please, Dan.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to say one more thing to what Michel has said about consultation. I think there's nothing stopping any organization who wishes BEREC to take anything into consideration when answering consultations by the Commission to just inform us. You just send us a letter with the views you wish us to take on board, and I think that happens relatively frequently, that we get those kind of inputs into the organization.
Thank you very much, Dan. With these meetings taking place online, one of the benefits is we've got friends from around the world now connecting to follow interesting European meetings. And this is sadly an issue that is not confined to Europe. This is an issue that operators are confronting all around the world. And it's not just European telco. I think European operators and regulators around the world watching us this afternoon will be keen to find the answers. So the question is from Giga Europe. And Giga Europe is asking, okay, we know that the granting of building permits for base stations, street cabinets, digging up the street is not delivered by NRAs, otherwise things would run smoothly. It's more by local mayor and so on. But is there not something that BEREC and its members could do to speed up the process, to encourage local politicians to deliver buildings permit more swiftly? This is the question. So, yeah. That's a tough question. That's a tough question. Dan, you want to handle it?
Yeah. Yes, I'll have a go at it. Thank you. So, of course, this is an area where I think all the NRAs are already active, depending on what is happening in their national market. And I think we are already, as BEREC, sharing experiences on this. But it's true, of course, as you say, that this is not an area where neither BEREC nor the NRAs are the ones handing out the permits or making the decisions. But we have to work with other agencies. But it's clear, of course, that promoting connectivity involves facilitating the rollout and take up even of high capacity networks. This is clearly part of our strategy. And there are many things that we can do in our own sort of national theaters. I'll give a couple of examples from things that we have found useful here in Sweden. So when it comes to digging, which was explicitly mentioned in the question, the PTS is already now since some time providing a database where we coordinate different interests who wants to dig in a certain area. And the idea, of course, is to try to find or enable people who want to dig in the same place to cooperate and reduce the cost by digging at same once rather than several times. It might be the electricity company together with a cable company or whatever other combination. And another example of experience we have is that we sometimes have had the pleasure of having a sort of mediating role, sort of stepping in between operators on the one hand and an agency who is responsible for some sort of permit or planning decisions, and just to try to make the two sides speak better and understand each other better. That's a role I think the NRA can sometimes usefully take and smooth a little bit the sometimes difficulties of understanding where the other is coming from. So I think there are many things that the NRAs can do, and what the NRAs can do, we can share in BEREC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Michel, Annemarie, you want to add something on this crucial topic? No, everything has been said, I think, by Dan. Thank you very much, Dan. The next question is from MVNO Europe, and I read it. So, has BEREC it's again a rather straightforward question. Has BEREC been contacted by the European Commission to work on an opinion focusing on the upcoming roaming review and the legislative proposal that is expected in the first quarter of next year?
Okay, I'll take that as well. Thank you. So yes, indeed, this is an area where we have in fact done quite a bit of work. We have provided input to the Commission no less than 3 times. We had an opinion in June of 2019 and a follow-up opinion as late as June of this year. We also had a little bit of supplementary analysis on wholesale roaming costs in September of 2019. And all 3 of these input documents have been published on the website, so you can refer to them there. And maybe just to name a few of the things that we have highlighted there as areas of possible improvement. Quality of service is something we have seen and discussed a little bit. The issue there is that subscribers may receive lower quality connections on roaming in another member state than they do at home, like 3G instead of 4G. That is one issue. We have also had a look at the position of MVNOs in particular, where dependency on the host MNO may make it challenging to achieve discounts or better rates than the regulated ones. And the derogation mechanism can be too complex at times. And the last area to mention maybe is value-added services, where we have also identified scope for improvement in some areas prone to fraud or misuse of roaming with premium rate services. And all of those items can be found in the documents I referred to on the homepage.
Thank you very much, Dan. Next question, please, Quentin. Thank you. And this is a question from... okay, yes. Alors, this is a question that came through the chat box, so I have no idea who asked for it, but it's a very good question. So I take this opportunity to say that I'm checking the timing. I think we still have a bit of bandwidth for a couple of more questions. I mean, we have a few questions in the pipeline, but for additional questions. So if you are in the audience and are thinking about asking a question, keep it short and add the name of the organization at the beginning. So anyway, it's a good question. Whoever asked raised it. So most telcos want to be platform provider, especially for 5G. Will they be regulated as platforms? Annemarie, you specialize on DSA issues, so today, this afternoon, so do you want to...
I am, and as we all know, the DSA or the platform regulation has not been finalized yet by the co-legislators. So they might be. But I do think that telecom operators who look like telecom operators will first and foremost be regulated as telecom operators. And I know at present, as much as the rest of us, how platforms will be regulated. So I think this is still way out there, and we will get more clarification in 21, hopefully.
Thank you very much. I think this is a clear answer. Quentin, next question, please. This is a question from Vodafone, if I remember correctly. So this is a question on, actually, Commissioner Breton reminded us that 20% of the 750 billion next Gen EU will be dedicated to digital priorities. And Vodafone question is as follows. So they are alluding to these massive funds and say, could it be that this influx of massive funds into telecom and digital could reinforce existing dominant position? And what role can NRAs and BEREC play in order to ensure that competition in telecom market is preserved? So who wishes? Annemarie, that's a competition law issue almost, you know. So
I know if this was a Dutch, well, state aid is of course within the jurisdiction of the Commission. Questions matters of state aid. But as Michel already mentioned, this is why I think that BEREC will include this in their opinion on the new EU state aid regulation. So our opinion on this and our views on how to deal with this best will be included in that opinion, which is due, I think, in the first half of 21.
Much, Annemarie. Next question, please, Quentin. This is a well, at least I'm sure everybody would have liked to ask this question, but it came from our friends from AIR in Ireland and from Giga Europe. They both raised more or less the same question, which we organizers summarize as follows. It's about the public acceptance of 5G and all the misinformation surrounding the rollout of 5G in some countries. And the question is, does BEREC intend to hold its workshop on EMF with stakeholders, you know, with operators, for example, and, you know, seek their input? And would it be appropriate for BEREC to engage in a dialogue with civil society, you know, including with what, it's my word, 5G skeptics, you know, like you have climate skeptics, maybe you have 5G skeptics. And, you know, the person asking the question said, you know, maybe we should reach out to the skeptics and not just stay between us who are convinced about the value of 5G. So is there a role for 5G, for BEREC to reach out and speak to the non-converted?
I take. Philippe?
Philippe? Over to you. Yes.
Yes, I will take this. Okay. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed, we will organize a workshop next year in 5G and EMF. And as I mentioned during the Stakeholder Forum last year, we are no health experts. So, you know, this is a sensitive topics, and that makes it difficult for BEREC to make bold statements in this EMF debate. So what's the plan in 2021? What we want to do is to have an exchange with a dialogue with other institutions that are having a voice in these debates. Those are the health organizations and the radiation authorities to consider possible approaches for the future with regards to the public information. So, like the operators, we are in favor of innovation, and we want to focus this EMF workshop on the interaction with the other competent institutions. We really need to understand each other better and learn from each other. In addition to that, referring to the second part of the question, I think it is important to engage with the civil society organizations and to enter in dialogue with them too. with the aim of understanding the underlying fear and provide valuable information to the citizens through our communications channels. And those fears are expressed about health, but also privacy, security, and environment. Over to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Michel, for those words. Anyone wishes to add a word? Yeah, voilà. Alors, this is, of course, a key topic when it comes to the encouraging the deployment of fiber is the management of copper switch off. There are two questions there which are raised by Deutsche Glasfaser. Does BEREC foresee different obligation where the incumbent migrate from copper to fiber, but not on its own network, on a third-party fiber network? You know, is this a particular scenario from a copper switch-off point of view? And second question, I remember discussing that this issue will never go away. It's a very good question. Could regulated copper price be used as a mechanism to accelerate the switching of a switch to fiber? So could regulated copper prices be used as a mechanism to accelerate the switch to fiber? So two questions there. Dan, Sweden is the country of fiber. So
yeah, I'll try happily to say something on copper switch off, which of course is an interesting topic. And I think everyone on the conference here is aware that the main method by which we regulate markets is by designating SMP status to telco operators who have significant market power. And we have a methodology by which we assess that, of course, which is, I think, well established and known by everyone. So I think the first part of the question really is about designating SMP status. So if, as suggested by the question, there is a third-party operator who rolls out a fiber network, this could perhaps, if this is the beginning of that process in a country, have an impact on the market power already decided or assessed with the incumbent operator. And if that is the case, of course, it will have an impact on the subsequent review of SMP status for the incumbent operator. So that will be a factual assessment taking all relevant market conditions into account. Does the incumbent operator still hold SMP or not, given that there is now a new fiber network being rolled out by a third party on which the incumbent is apparently buying services. Then as a second step, one could, of course, also imagine a situation where this new third-party operator continues to build out the fiber network, builds out a very ubiquitous fiber network across the country, and eventually might, in its own right, develop an SMP status. We will use the same methods of analysis again, and if found appropriate, there might have to be remedies on that supplier as well. So I think the first part of the question is really the traditional way we do market analysis and impose SMP status and remedies. And I think that the second part of the question is more perhaps, I think, up to each NRA to think about what is useful in terms of pricing flexibility for FTTP wholesale access in order to promote investment in new technologies in the territory, given all the circumstances of the market situation as it is. And our own experience has been that the legacy copper infrastructure continues often to exert a price constraint on the rollout of fiber up to a point. And that is hard to determine exactly when that point is hit, but as long as it does, it sort of anchors the price of the fiber, the rolled out fiber, because there will be sufficient amount of willing customers to switch back to copper if price for fiber was to increase too rapidly. But as I said, finding that exact position is complicated, and I think for that to be a driver of investment, which it has been, I think in Sweden, it's been a good driver of investment. It also you need to have a couple of other preconditions which are not necessarily within the gift of the NRA, and they're both on the demand on the supply side. Actually, on this demand side, you have to have sufficient amount of willing payers, so customers, private people or companies willing to pay for added value services that can be provided by fiber, but not easily through copper. And you also need to have some alternative investors on the supply side, and you need to have an environment where there is willing investors to compete for the market as it is, because with rollout of new fiber networks, initially you really have a competition for the market, and that has brought us relatively far up in the percentage terms of fiber being rolled out in Sweden. That is correct. So I think the lesson we have learned is that yes, it works, but it requires these preconditions. Thanks.
And this question was asked by Deutsche Glasfaser, but also by Intuc actually. Next question, please, Quentin. So this is a question from Hutchison, and I think I could have asked by many mobile operators actually, because there was, I'm told, an interesting GSMA meeting last week also in Tokyo. I mean, all online, where the European operators were quite impressed by progress made by the Asian counterparts. You know, whether on the supply side, on the demand side, there is really a feeling that in Asia, governments are pulling by, for example, strong demand in terms of smart cities, and on the supply side, they're helping with effective ways of facilitating the deployment of base stations. So that's the background to this question. It's some European operators a bit envious, if you like, of the support granted to mobile operators for the deployment of 5G in Asia. So the question is, BEREC 5G radar offers an assessment of where additional regulation may be required to protect consumers. That's fine, it's important. Is BEREC planning to review existing regulation to identify which one could be removed or simplified to assist 5G deployment? You cannot decide to speed up the development of smart cities, Michel, but what else can you do?
Thank you, Philippe. No, thank you very much for the questions, and indeed 5G promises to have a profound impact on how citizens and business view and use electronic communication services. This 5G radar aids BEREC to anticipate the pace of innovation and adjust accordingly. However, you will understand that BEREC in itself cannot decide, just to quote the question, to review existing regulations to identify which could be removed or simplified. It is not within our mandate. Each regulator is bound by its national legislations and the obligations stemming from the code. So any review needs to be examined by the member states and the European Commission. And I'm aware that in other continents, you refer to an event in Japan, Philippe, and so mostly in Asia. They are doing everything possible to boost both demand and access side to promote 5G. So the European Commission published a recommendation on connectivity last month, as you know, to pursue that objective. And the review of the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive will also further facilitate the rollout. So in this, BEREC will play a role in both instruments by exchange national experiences and come up with a set of best practices. And it is through these exchanges that we strive for an harmonized EU-wide approach that will boost 5G deployment and take up as swift as possible. Thank you, Philippe. Over to you.
Thank you, Michel. Next question, please, Quentin. This is a question from MVNO Europe, and the question is, in the future work on 5G, will BEREC put the emphasis on wholesale access to enable innovation and benefits for end users? Dan, wholesale access in the context of 5G, is there a renewed emphasis on that or not?
Well, thank you for the question. We have an ongoing consultation with the 5G radar, and where I think we have received this input and much other input, and the work of distilling how to deal with all the input there is ongoing. So it's a little bit awkward to answer to the question. We will proceed as we usually do with a consultation report that will be adopted at our forthcoming plenary meeting in December. So I think the friends at MVNO Europe will have to wait a little bit for the feedback on that one.
Thank you, Dan. Next question, Quentin. Will BEREC dedicate? Will BEREC dedicate part of its work to the commercial practices of some major handset manufacturers, deliberately limiting the openness and interoperability of their operating system? Thank you. Thank you. Who, Annemarie, do you want to?
You know, Philippe, that the DSA is one of my favorite subjects. Yes, I think that BEREC, in its opinion, is very careful to make sure that our opinion on the Digital Services Act also includes operating systems. So limiting the openness and interoperability of operating systems is very much in the scope of how we look at what would be wise to include in any regulatory intervention thought of by the co-legislators on the European level. And I do think I did have the impression that the Commission is very much on the same track. So I do think that they are using a kind of broad definition that not only looks at platforms, but also at operating systems. So I'm hoping, together with the organization that posed this question, that this will be included. Yes.
While we're on the DSA, there was a question from Telefonica that you partly answered earlier, but Telefonica was also raising the question, it's a factual question, is the Commission formally asked BEREC to play a role in the DSA and in the possible application of ex-ante rules? Or, so voilà.
Well, as you know, Philippe, we have just issued this opinion, and as Commissioner Breton said, they received 3,000, as I think I heard him say 3,000 reactions. They're very much in busy processing that, and of course, as we regularly do when we issue opinions, we are in a dialogue with them. And I think it's too early to tell how concrete this dialogue is. I mean, they're talking to to a lot of parties and also to us regarding our input.
Het rol is, huh?
Thank you. Presumably, in the 3,000, BEREC was probably on the top of the list or close to the top.
I am not the one to ask, Philippe. I think we should be, but I'm not sure.
You wish to
We
add
agree
something?
Yes, Philippe. Oh, sorry, please.
Yeah. No, I think Quentin is indicating to me that it's time to move to the next thing. But on this, so no formal request from the Commission at this stage, is what I gather, but more informal contact. That's great. But thank you so much. I don't know how we managed, but I think that we managed to go through absolutely all the questions, and it's now 3:20, so it's time to hand over to for the debate. And I'm delighted to now introduce Matthew Newman, who is a chief correspondent Europe at MLEX, and who will take over the rest of the afternoon, which will be largely dedicated to the DSA. Matthew, over to you.
I would like to just give a short introduction to the next part of the debate. Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Newman. I'm Chief Correspondent at MLEX. And we're going to be focusing on the Digital Services Act. So I'm going to just give a few comments about that and then introduce our keynote speaker. Digital markets and platforms have transformed the way we live and do business. For many citizens, their days begin and end by checking the latest tweet and sharing the latest news or funny joke on these platforms. For businesses of all sizes, and especially small enterprises, large digital platforms have become essential to selling products and services, as well as expanding their businesses and reaching new customers. These very large platforms have developed what the European Commission calls gatekeeper power. Several high-profile competition cases have shown that this market position allows them to engage in anti-competitive and unfair practices. As Commissioner Breton just told us today, policymakers are concerned that certain platforms have become so systemic to the way we live and do business online that they may be, quote, too big to care. We're now at a crucial time in platform regulation. In the next few weeks, the Commission will announce 2 initiatives as part of the Digital Services Act to update e-commerce rules that are 20 years old and tackle problems related to structural competition issues in digital markets. The first initiative will deal with platforms' responsibility for content. It will cover the growing problem of illegal content, such as hate speech and child pornography, as well as online ad transparency and disinformation. The second initiative, now known as the Digital Markets Act, will tackle the market power of gatekeepers. It will include rules against anti-competitive behavior, removing the need for lengthy antitrust investigations that sometimes take too long and often achieve very little. In recent days, France and the Netherlands have backed the Commission's plans for a list of do's and don'ts for powerful digital platforms, accompanied with a more flexible mechanism to scrutinize and remedy the conduct of gatekeepers on a case-by-case basis. The French and Dutch digital ministers also said that breaking up big companies is also a possibility. We're clearly in an exciting time for platform regulation that will have a profound effect on the way big companies operate. The end game is more choice and innovation. Today we'll get to exchange ideas on how to get there. To kick us off, we'll hear from William Kovacic. Professor Kovacic is the Global Competition Professor of Law and Policy at George Washington University. He is well known to anyone who follows competition policy and especially the role of platforms. From January 2006 to October 2011, he was a member of the Federal Trade Commission and chaired the agency from March 2008 to March 2009. He was the FTC's general counsel from June 2001 to December 2004. Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and I'm enormously grateful to Berec, to Philippe, to Michel, and to Dan for the honor of participating in this exciting debate and discussion. I want to situate the discussion about the DSA and the global debate about the appropriate way ahead for competition law and for other areas of policymaking. If I can turn to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick outline of the agenda. I plan to take a look first at just describe the foundation of literature that supported the approach towards regulatory policy intervention, a little bit about the policy diagnosis that underpins the decision to develop the DSA, and to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of proposed solutions and a bit about the timing, about how things unfold. In doing this, I'm giving you my views only and not those of the Competition and Markets Authority in the United Kingdom, where I sit on their board, but I'm certainly influenced by what I've learned from that experience about the development of policy for digital platforms. If I can turn to the next slide, please. There's a huge literature that in many ways created tremendous momentum, carrying us in the direction that we're going. The Furman report in the United Kingdom proposed the creation of a digital markets unit. The Kramer experts report for DG Comp spoke about turning beyond the boundaries of competition law and policy to develop appropriate public policy responses. The Stigler Center's report in the United States, an extensive report by the ACCC, and most recently, a report by one component of the US Congress about the appropriate way ahead. Next slide, please. I'm going to use the US example simply to show how much attention and concern there is developed around the creation of a new regulatory instrument. These are the familiar four. For the first time, they appeared together before a congressional hearing. They were questioned extensively. What was striking about the inquiry that took place is how many of the questions did not deal with traditional competition law and policy. Some did, especially about merger control. But most of them dealt with policy domains that lie at the boundaries of competition law, but did not overlap with it. The next slide, please. In many ways, this hearing foreshadowed the report that appeared at the beginning of the month. A House of Representatives subcommittee, the subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law, published an extensive report on digital. Much of that report laid out a vision of future regulation that did not deal with recourse to traditional competition policy tools. It's a very significant endorsement of the view that we see reflected in the consideration of the DSA, a global view now that competition law itself is not enough. Next slide, please. I would say if we look at all of the literature, reports, and policy discussion globally, we see the following view about what are now called platform gatekeepers. That they have substantial and durable market power, not just the famous four that we saw before, but a number of others as well. That they suppress competition, for example, through the acquisition of nascent rivals. That they impose very oppressive contract terms on customers and on their own third parties with whom they deal with, selling on the platform. That they harm rivals with self-preferencing mechanisms and the collection of information about platform transactions by third parties that's gathered and then turned to compete against them, that they routinely ignore privacy law commands, data protection, and that they treat their own workers very badly. Next slide. The solution, well, what about competition law? Yeah, that'll be part of the mix, no doubt, especially tougher merger control regarding the purchase of nascent rivals. Both the United States and the United Kingdom waived the Instagram acquisition by Facebook through. tougher merger control on complementary vertical assets, where both the United States and the European Commission allowed Google to buy DoubleClick in 2007, 2008. And yes, much more exacting abusive dominance enforcement, especially dealing with demands for exclusivity by major platforms. But a clear view of this literature and commentary is that competition law isn't enough. Case-by-case litigation doesn't give you the opportunity to take a broad perspective on what's happening in the larger sector and in related sectors and to analyze that. Real doubts about the remedies achieved to date and expressions of doubt by current and former DG Comp officials. When the Google prosecutions initially yielded big fines, that got the headlines, nice big round numbers in the billions. But today, I think the reaction to the fines is, so what? Does Google really care about $9 billion collectively, or 9 billion euros in fines? I'm sure Google would rather keep 9 billion euros than put it into the European Treasury. But is that really going to change the way it behaves? More and more observers say no, and repeated questions about the effectiveness of the conduct achieved in those European prosecutions. And the view that many of the problems that we're seeing are arising in other policy domains, such as data protection, consumer protection. And note that many of the people who are saying it's not enough are traditional competition people. I think our colleagues in the regulatory policy sphere are well aware that competition people have tended to look down their noses at regulation, at least in many instances, and to think that competition law was a superior, better tool. This is an instance in which the message about the need for regulation is coming from the competition community itself. Next slide. The solution is competition law plus. Again, if we look at this most recent menu in the House Judiciary Subcommittee report, it's enormously sympathetic to the vision that is motivating the development of the DSA. The report tells the competition agencies, go bring big cases. And probably this week, the Department of Justice is going to launch a major monopolization case against Google. Highly likely that by the end of this calendar year, our member states will individually or collectively launch additional cases against Google, and the Federal Trade Commission will sue Facebook. So that's going to happen. But it proposes as well major amendments to the existing framework of competition law, notable changes to the merger control regime, but very significantly, it proposes new regulatory frameworks involving platform structure and conduct. You can say that the most important elements of that report do not deal with traditional competition law, and this aligns the report very closely with the DSA proposal, with the United Kingdom's intent to create the Firmin Digital Markets Unit, not yet established where it goes, but the commitment of government to do that. We're seeing a fundamental shift in the direction of regulatory policy responses and not reliance exclusively or mainly on competition law. Next slide, please. What's the motivation for this? As we said before, a lot of disappointment with competition law enforcement to date. The European effort through DG Comp has been robust, it's been persistent, it's been significant, but I think a general view is in restraining Google, not very effective. And there's been a rethink of regulation by the larger competition law community and community of policymakers. The question is competition law so good? Is regulation, which is so often historically derided as not being adequate, is it really so bad? Basic rethink of both. And there's an awareness that the right solution to the problem is going to have to involve contributions from a variety of policy domains, 3 in particular. It's going to be the juncture of competition law, data protection law, and consumer protection law. Next slide, please. So the proposed regulatory approach, in many ways, focus on prescriptive ex-ante rulemaking. That's going to be the main tool going ahead. And the substantive commands are going to focus on what's called self-preferencing. Can a platform pitch its own goods and services in a way that makes them most readily visible to users and subordinates the presentation of alternatives? Structural separations and line of business restrictions. This is the most vivid and avant-garde element of the US proposals in the House of Representatives to force, for example, Amazon to participate either as the operator of a platform or a seller of goods and services, but not to do both. Abuse of superior bargaining position is a major ingredient of policymaking, where the concern is, to paraphrase Commissioner Breton, is that not only do firms go about routinely, unilaterally changing terms, imposing terms that are onerous, but they simply don't care. And they look back at the consumer and say, what are you going to do about it? Well, good luck. You don't have any choices. Take these measures and get to like them. And privacy-related commands that deal with the collection and use of data, all of them packed in to the proposed regulatory program. Next slide, please. Why does this make sense? That is, why is the direction toward a more regulatory approach sensible? Here are a few reasons. One, it recognizes that the answer to the problem is not just going to come from traditional competition law enforcement, but that you're going to have to bring to bear several different policy domains in a coordinated manner. Second, ex-ante rulemaking gives you an opportunity to look at the field and look at the problem more comprehensively, gather more relevant information, and come up with a better remedy and a better mechanism for implementation. And third, it's going to avoid the tendency and the perceived need of competition agencies to stretch their competition law mandates to the limits or beyond to address infirmities in collateral regulatory schemes, such as data protection. For example, the German Facebook case is an innovative, imaginative, indeed bold effort to address a variety of problems that arguably originate in the field of data protection or in the field of what we would call contract law or consumer protection law. It's an innovative effort to address those under the umbrella of competition law. The approach of regulatory policymaking arguably makes that easier to do without, again, bending, stretching the framework of existing competition law. These are the reasons that the regulatory approaches, including the current vision of the DSA, make sense. Next slide, please. To finish, what's hard about it? First, lots of hard technical issues about implementing these. Some of these already presented in the questions posed to our colleagues a moment ago. Who's a covered platform? Ask yourselves, in what year did the GAFA firms become dominant? Take each one of them and say, this was the year that dominance was achieved. At what point do you become dominant? Is there a way of getting off that list? And in what respect is monopoly power in this sector durable? What level of persistence is necessary to be put onto the list of gatekeepers? As you write the rule and develop the framework, it can't simply be our impressions about this. There'll have to be criteria that are meaningful. Those are hard to address. Second, who should do it? We've already talked about this. Is this the domain of a new regulator? Do you create something new? Do you establish it at the commission level? Do you establish it at the member state level? Or do you give it to someone who's already there? I mean, my own intuition would be, listening to Annemarie speak and her colleagues at the ACM, I'd give it to an authority that already does make policy at this intersection of different domains. The ACM is a competition authority, it's a consumer authority, it has regulatory responsibilities. If I was thinking about where it goes, certainly at the member state level, I'd say you'd give it to the ACM. And you'd listen very carefully to the ACM's contributions to the discussion about what this framework should be and how it should operate. Still not clear, for example, in the European Union where the Digital Markets Unit is going to go. Does it go to the Competition and Markets Authority? Does it go to the Communications Regulator? Or do you set it up as a standalone institution? If you create the new functions, you're going to pay for them. I'd simply note that to do work in this area well, you need top quality people from, yes, law, yes, economics, engineering, science, computer science, if you're not going to bring in first-rate people from this area, you can do a lot of damage. So are the jurisdictions that are keen on doing this going to pay for it, and to pay for it in a robust way? I think they should, but that's not always the impulse of public policy, especially listening to us taxpayers who say, we want a Mercedes quality vehicle, but we only want to pay for a humble Chevrolet. How to frame the substantive commands. Should the DSA go in the direction of the structural separations? Should it go in the direction of simply interoperability commands plus non-discrimination requirements? Should there be an abuse of superior bargaining position component to it? Should there be data protection commands, or so should those simply be referred to by reference with a collaborative framework that takes place between the digital regulatory authority and the privacy authority? And last, how should you execute policy? If you're going to have an asymmetric bargaining power provision there, do you set up an arbitration mechanism that's overseen by a public authority? Do you simply have direct enforcement? Do you have direct enforcement by one of the commission directorates, by the commission itself, or is that delegated to the member states? Commissioner Breton mentioned a multi-layered system with the commission, member states. That's a nice vision, but as we all know, it's interesting to see about how that's actually going to be designed and implemented. Who does what? That's not an interesting question to take on. That's difficult to do. Last slide, please. Some finishing thoughts. Just a prediction about the sequencing of these events globally. I think the DSA will be first. That train's moving relatively quickly compared to the others, likely to be in place in 2021. What about the Furman proposals in the UK? Probably not till mid-2021 at the earliest. There's some other event coming up at the end of December that's commanding a lot of attention in the United Kingdom and in Europe for that matter as well. Furman probably comes into being in the middle of 2021. Then US legislation. Probably not in 2021, probably in early 2022, assuming that there's a Biden sweep of not just the White House, but the House of Representatives and the US Senate. It raises a question, as we have all of this national initiative or jurisdictional initiative, how much are these jurisdictions going to work with each other to try to achieve some harmonious result where harmony is appropriate and desirable? Is that going to happen? How much are they learning from each other? How much genuine discussion and conversation is taking place about what to do and how to do it? Ideally, policymakers, I think, would say there should be a lot of it. I'm not sure how much of it will happen. It underscores the role of BEREC and related associations, bringing together the experience of all the regulators who've done some of this before, who have the knowledge and know-how, and the member state institutions who are especially attuned to the problem of how implementation takes place. They know how hard it is to do, and they know that the only people who think it's easy have never done it. So these contributions through associations like BEREC, indispensable to making sure that all of this lands well. Thank you, and I look forward to the debate.
Yes, Bill, thank you very much. That was, as you promised, very exciting, and it looks even like you might be giving a new job to Annemarie at the ACM if she's ready to take it on. There's also nice previews of election results coming up on November 3rd. So Bill, we'll see if you're right about that. So I want to just start by introducing the panel. We've got a fantastic panel today to talk about these issues, and I'm really looking forward to the debate. We've got about a little bit, about an hour to discuss these issues, and with the panelists, and I'm just going to run through who we have. Ben, I am not doing this in any particular order because I don't know where people are on your screen. But Benedict Blomeyer is the Director of EU Policy at the Allied for Startups Association. Before joining AFS, he worked for a small business alliance and Deutsche Welle and completed a traineeship at the Council of Europe. Kai Jebeli is the Competition and Regulatory Counsel to the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCIA, in Brussels, where he represents and advises the association on competition policy issues and regulatory affairs. Ursula Paschal, she is Deputy Director General at BEUC, which is probably well known to everyone here. That's the European Consumer Organization. She's worked at BEUC since 1997, first as a legal advisor, then as a senior policy advisor, and now as Deputy Director General. Then we have Luc Hendricks, who is the Executive Director at the European Competitive Telecommunications Association, otherwise known as ECTA. Mr. Hendricks has more than 20 years of experience in the telecom industry and has been very active in business development, operations leadership, and regulatory policy affairs. And finally, Lise Fur, she is the Director General for ETNO, which is the European Telecommunications Network Operators Association, and she took that role in January 2016. She's also on the board of an administrative committee in the European Cybersecurity Organization. So we have our fantastic panel ahead, and I'm going to allow them to speak. And I think that the first one up for our discussion will be Ursula. So floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. I hope you can hear me well. Because you mentioned in the introduction that I've been working in consumer policy for a long time, that makes me think that I would like to start by saying when the e-commerce directive was negotiated in legislative procedure 20 years ago, and when it was adopted, I remember that there were many people saying, well, consumers, they don't need so much protection any longer because the internet and e-commerce will make them so powerful. They can reach out all over the European Union and single market. They can compare prices. They have comparison tools. If they don't like something, if they are not satisfied, they can denounce a trader, etc., etc. I mean, we obviously didn't think that this was the case 20 years ago, but I think it's good to think what we thought maybe a long time ago and how this has changed and how this must change now, because I hope you will agree that we can say consumers are actually much more vulnerable in the digital markets than they have been in the brick and mortar markets. And I often hear say that we should have the same level of protection. Well, actually, we must have much more protection for consumers in the online markets because the situation is very different. We are talking about a digital asymmetry. That means that the powers have significantly changed, and it's to the disadvantage of consumers. There are so powerful big companies that operate now, and that is not only, of course, for consumers, but it's also, of course, for competitors problematic. So consumer problems that are often related to these market constellations are the lack of choice, lock-in effects, the lack of transparency, personal data exploitation via permanent tracking, targeting, consequently personalization of offers, of prices, leading to manipulation, undue influence. We see dark patterns. We see also, and that's important, I'll come back to that, a proliferation of dangerous products on platforms, much more than a few years ago. Are consumers exposed to non-compliant products and services that they can buy or are supposed to buy from these markets, not to talk about disinformation and the concerns with regards to our democracy. So a fair marketplace and fair business practices, healthy competition is more important than ever. And the Digital Services Act must really serve consumers, and it must better protect consumers. So there are two angles from our point of view. On the one hand, as I said, the market needs to be strengthened to be competitive and fair, allowing greater choice for consumers. And the second point, and that is for us, the focus on the form of the e-commerce directive is to put more liability on the online marketplaces. So not on everything, but on online marketplaces we think there is a particular need for holding them to account. And I'll come back to that in a second. A few thoughts on the first element about what is more the competition law part. Here, as has been said by the keynote speaker, I think very well, competition law has been a very valuable tool, of course, has been able to tackle the many issues in the market, but it has also clearly shown its limits when it comes to the digital markets with regards to the new technology, the speed about how the markets develop, the network effects, etc., etc. If you think about the Google shopping case that started 10 years ago, and in our opinion, there is still no decent remedy in place to address the issue. So there could be very soon no other comparison service available to consumers. I think that's not how we want the market to evolve. What we favor is a list of unfair and prohibited practices. So a clear obligation not to engage in such specified practices. The overall idea, of course, is to prevent and not always to run after the development, but rather prevent already and not cure. So I'll come back maybe later on to explain a little bit what we think should be in such a blacklist that needs to be very clear. I think that is absolutely important. It needs to be what we call self-enforcing, so the businesses can understand easily what they need to do and what they must not do. We have actually an example in consumer law where we have a list of unfair commercial practices, but that has a much more narrow scope. It's a similar technique and it is very powerful. So we think that can be done at the European level also in an asymmetric way. Maybe the last point there is we think it should be a horizontal tool, not limited to digital markets, in particular when I speak about, of course, the new enforcement tool. So these investigative powers, etc., they should be horizontally available, not only for digital markets. And then very shortly on the e-commerce directive. So it's not that we say the general principles of the e-commerce directive should be changed, but what we would like to see is a response to the problem that in the past years there has been a tsunami of unsafe products, of services, of scams, of unfair practices coming through these platforms that is unprecedented. And we have not seen the right responses to that. So we think it would be adequate that there is more liability on the platforms. They shouldn't be too big to not care. They must be held liable. So in certain circumstances, we want them to have a civil liability for damages that are caused by such listings of illegal products or services. The example is, for example, the COVID crisis, where we have seen masses of scams and unfair practices, price gouging on these platforms, and there is nearly nothing that can be done about it. Platforms have reacted, but we think that authorities should also have a way to force them to do more, and they should do more by themselves based on the law. Know your business user, that principle is also important and could help to improve the situation. And we also want platforms to monitor if they are marketplaces from time to time in a random way what goes on. And if there is illegal activity. So these are our main points. I leave it here for the time being. Thank you, Matthew.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, just to move on, I think that you raised some interesting points. So hopefully we'll get into the aspects of liability with in our questions. I'll pass the floor on to our next speaker. I already introduced him, but Benedict Blumeyer, the floor is yours. Seems like he has a sound problem.
Let me try that again. Thanks.
Okay. All set.
I just wanted to start with a quick thank you also to BEREC. I think you're really on the money with this discussion topic. I'll keep my opening remarks brief to allow as much time as possible for the interactive part. For those of you who don't know us, Allied for Startups is a global network of 45 startup organizations representing also thousands of platform startups. And we like to think that we're the voice of these platform startups in politics and government. Now, especially for a startup organization, in the last months, everything for us has become digital and including platforms. We're embracing the challenge, and entrepreneurs in our membership are still bullish and trying to face this crisis as an opportunity. In that light, we are building our own champions here in Europe, and the amount of VC in the market is also recovering. Now, for our members, the Digital Services Act is a top priority. And to kick off the discussion, I'd like to share 3 thoughts. In the last months, we've been on a virtual roadshow throughout Europe to our members and have been learning about how changes in the liability regime could affect them. We've seen some of the over 10,000 platform startups who approached the DSA as an enormous opportunity to get an overhauled and a more harmonized EU liability regime. Concretely, we believe any limited liability exemption should positively take into account proactive measures entrepreneurs make to remove illegal content online. These should be incentivized. In this process of discussing updates and procedural obligations, it's very important to us to maintain the no monitoring obligation. Besides liability, there's also a chance to reaffirm the country of origin principle. Just one example from our roadshow, for instance. I'm sure you all know SoundCloud, which is a big European platform, which has had to make a lot of investments to get NetzDG, the network enforcement law in Germany, right. And the trust and safety team there is now on a 24-hour notice to meet the reporting deadline. If you now factor in, for instance, the law Avia in France, which proposes a 1-hour deadline, this would necessitate significantly more headcount and would actually triple the costs for the trust and safety team at SoundCloud alone. So while the DSA has the potential to really focus on startups and ease of scaling up in Europe, we have to be mindful that startups are still kind of with less resources at hand. Secondly, for us, it seems like the DSA has a kind of one proposal fits all approach sometimes. I understand why this framing is helpful politically, but we are concerned that it makes transparent policymaking more difficult and might exclude SME and startup voices. We observe many different challenges that are seemingly being addressed with this one legislation. I said it already on a panel last year, actually, but since it's already the end of October again, I can bring out the analogy again of avoiding a Christmas tree legislation. We've heard talk of illegal, of harmful content, of platform workers, disinformation, election integrity, and we don't dispute that these are all, there's issues here in all of these sectors, but the more topics we try to address in one go, the harder it becomes for smaller players like startups to have a voice in the debate, the harder it might be to find a compromise politically, and frankly, the more complex legislation becomes, the more it will be relatively easier for bigger players to deal with and leave smaller players with more upfront costs and investments to make before challenging incumbents in the market. So throughout the legislation, let's define and be specific about the problem we're looking at to solve. And every effort we can make to focus the debate and make sure the legislative remedies are proportionate and affordable, with a view to scaling up in Europe as well, we think would pay off in the long run, especially with a view for our green and digital recovery. Thirdly, the idea, the notion that we're targeting big platforms to make space for smaller startups in the Digital Markets Act is a narrative we've heard before and on other policy files, and that hasn't gone well in our experience. The reality is, the way we see it, is that there aren't just big players and small players, and that it's more of an interconnected ecosystem. Numerous studies show, for instance, that app-related jobs are creating jobs that didn't exist 12 years ago. The startups in these ecosystems are interdependent with bigger platforms, like startups and platforms are interdependent with the rest of the economy. So just an example, a social impact startup fighting food waste can build its services on an existing map using a map API, helps the startups as it doesn't have to reinvent the wheel but can use best-in-class services which are already out there. And it also helps the consumer because privacy settings are already uniformly applied across the board. So maybe taking a step back on this, startup founders kind of build a business with the goal of being a number one, to be a global leader, to challenge the big incumbents, also the Googles of our economy. And we think there should be no limit to the ambition of European startups. So one worst case scenario for us would be building an overly complex set of ex-ante rules that dissuade startups from becoming big. And I have to kind of share an experience from the past, as we've seen from the copyright directive, is that we should avoid a situation where legislation essentially ring fences bigger players and will lead to startups having to buy proprietary technologies from these bigger platforms. So instead of a narrative and legislation about hitting big players and creating new empires by breaking up companies, we think we should be investing our time and resources more into supporting startups in Europe. And so often we see a startup starting out as a story of an unmet consumer need, and startups being as close to consumers as no business in the past has been. And that's something we think we should be leveraging. We'll actually be presenting an economic impact assessment on the DSA next week. So I'm happy to share with the organizers here kind of the invitation, so you can all join up to that. For now, I'll leave it with this. And thanks you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, Benedict, thank you very, very much. It's always really good to get the perspective of small companies, startups, particularly because when you hear the European Commission talk about these issues, the sort of the holy grail is to help startups. I'm going to pass the floor on to our next speaker, Kai Jebeli. Introduced him just a moment ago. He is from CCIA. The floor is yours, Kai.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to BEREC for this opportunity. For those who don't know, CCIA is a nonprofit trade association that has been representing the interests of the computer and communications industry for nearly 50 years. Our mission is to promote open markets, open systems, and open networks. Some, if not all, of society's most useful innovations are the byproduct of competition. In fact, although it may sound counterintuitive, innovation often flourishes when an incumbent is threatened by a new entrant, because the threat of losing users to the competition drives product innovation, product improvement, and it's the internet and the products and services that there is no exception in this space. Companies do need to constantly stay on their toes, as the next startup is ready to knock them down with a better product. Often this kind of innovative, disruptive entry and expansion happens by introducing an improved product or service to a niche of the wider market, and then slowly expanding from that niche into other segments. New technologies are constantly emerging that promise to change our lives for the better, and the pace of innovation has only quickened, as the internet has enabled intermediation from grocery shopping, food delivery, remote work, school lessons, and electronic health and fitness plans. We think that preserving an innovation-friendly environment is of tantamount importance, not only to businesses, but society at large. This means that innovators need to be able to capture the value of their innovations. It's the incentive, the carrot, that drives competition and generates the consumer surplus we all enjoy. Of course, there is a legitimate debate as to whether digital platforms are capturing more than the value of their innovations. There are those that the majority of the value generated by the platforms is due to the data provided by users, or due to the network effects of having a large number of users, which drives vigorous competition between suppliers and brings prices down, thus attracting even more users. One complaint is that digital platforms do not pay enough in taxes, and we at CCIA do support and encourage ambitious global tax reform to address this. But we are concerned when we see regulatory proposals based on analysis that overstate the extent to which digital sectors have competition problems. We are particularly concerned by proposals that suggest that the size of the digital platforms itself is a problem and evidence of a lack of competition that needs to be addressed. Critics of the current landscape say that there is a winner-take-all dynamic, but is this really true? If the so-called gatekeepers were already winners, having taken it all, why do they continuously improve and optimize their platforms and business practices, quickly adapting their services in response to evolving consumer demand? Surely this is a sign of existing competitive pressure. When we talk of structurally entrenched market positions, we often ignore how dynamic these markets have been and how much they have changed over the last 10 years. If we choose to ignore these inconvenient facts, isn't there a risk that our prescriptions will miss the mark and negatively impact a system that has generated many consumer benefits? Of course, some will accept that there are competitive outcomes in these markets, that new players like Spotify, Shopify, Zoom, and TikTok can enter and grow and win customer attention at an incredibly rapid pace, and that consumer needs are being met. But, they will say, there are not enough European players in this mix, and we need to encourage our own European champions and our technological sovereignty. This is an important issue, of course, and we need to do better to attract talent and innovation, the best technical, managerial, commercial staff, and investment capacity in Europe. But will a more protectionist policy send the right message? China has seen some success in closing its digital markets to foreign competitors, but we are not China. And we have to ask whether closing our markets to the best tools and future innovations developed abroad will serve our interests, particularly at a time when we need to rebound from the biggest economic recession in memory. The ex-ante regulatory framework from the Electronic Communication Service has shown that business users and citizens can benefit from well-crafted sector-specific regulation that addresses structural problems and enables competition and innovation. We support measures to harmonize rules in member states relating to the unfair behavior of some platforms with significant intermediation power. But the platform to business regulation has barely come into force, and after only a few months of consultation, we are already expecting new far-reaching rules impacting the digital space. We need confidence that these rules are driven by the interests of consumers and pro-competitive outcomes, and not the complaints of competitors petitioning government their own commercial interests. In this respect, I want to briefly speak about two important considerations. One, defining significant intermediation power or gatekeeper power, and two, altering the economic incentives where that power is identified. It is obvious that a few large platforms are the entry points to a large volume of potential customers, but this doesn't mean that they are in control of a specific and irreplaceable bottleneck. In the telecoms framework, companies have exclusive rights to deploy the infrastructure to deliver their services or use certain spectrum. There are no exclusive rights on the internet, except in places like China. Every company with a sufficiently valuable and differentiated service can attract users. We should not be punishing companies simply for doing something better than their rivals or offering a service that is too convenient. If we want to attract the greatest talent to Europe, we need to show that we can also reward success. My last point is that we should also consider how competitive incentives change when we extinguish proprietary rights and force platforms to open up access to their infrastructure or learnings. Putting aside what this does to the incentives of that incumbent to invest further in the ecosystem, there are significant advantages to being a regulated incumbent and a risk that regulation will reinforce market power. If a competitor can adopt a remedy taker business model, there are reduced incentives to challenge that incumbent directly. Incumbent lock-in is a risk, and we should be fostering innovative disruption of existing incumbents rather than encouraging new businesses to be even more reliant on them. There are, of course, a number of other considerations in crafting good legislation. Each should be duly assessed objectively and addressed in a proportionate manner. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. A lot of food for thought, and I hope we can get into the debate about gatekeepers. But I think Guy just offered some very good counterbalance to what we heard earlier. So I'm going to pass the floor on to Luke. I think is our next speaker, if I've gotten the running order correct.
Yes, I hope
yes,
that
I have.
everybody can hear me. Yeah,
Luke,
I
the
have
floor
some
is yours.
slides. So, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, I have some slides. So if you could put them on the screen, please. Voilà. So please, could you move to the next slide? So first, I would like to thank to BEREC to give us the opportunity to present our views on this very important topic. And before I start, a few words on who we are. So I'm used to say that at ECTA, the European Competitive Telecommunications Association, we represent the competitive forces in Europe. And as the previous speaker said, yes, competition is very important for innovation. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, you see that the telecom infrastructure and our members have made that network resilience and redundancy was very important. And all the digital services are, of course, totally dependent from the telecom infrastructure that is behind. And now in our ecosystem, we have several of our members, of course, that move from the classical telecom services to the digital services areas. And I would say that despite some thoughts and some things that we heard about our sector is far from a commodity. We are offering added value services in various areas, and I would say, and we hope that we will be able to continue that to continue that in the future, and make sure that competition would not be sacrificed to create what some would love to see, European champions. Next slide, please. So first, would like to share some of our views on the reforming of the e-commerce directive under the Digital Services Act. So the point has been mentioned before. So on the liability regulation, we believe that the graduated liability rule that's provided in the e-commerce directive should be and must be maintained. The next point that we find important is that the future regulation must ensure that they do not create new incentive for market strong platform to choose in fact their own headquarters, so to cherry pick where the rules would be the most advantageous for them. So the rules needs to be harmonized all through the European Union. The third point that is important is that, and I think Professor said it quite well as well, the binding criteria should be defined for the platform subject to regulation. So a clearly defined and pre-established list of obligation and prohibited commercial practices should be established. I will come back to that little bit later on when I will discuss a kind of SMP-alike regime. And of course, a key point is that the platform interoperability and data transferability are fundamental. The final point that I want to mention at this stage is that the algorithm transparency for gatekeeper platform acting as an active hosting service provider is very important. Luckily on that, I have to say that we would be aligned with Timo Wulken when he presented during his press conference the report from the parliament before they just were to vote it. That's something that we would favor. Next slide, please. Then there is one key important point, and you all notice this, and even those that have kids, just to give you two examples, my youngest son is in the secondary school, and when you say you have to log in to the platform of the school, the first choice you have is to log in via Microsoft. The second choice is to log in via Gmail, and the third choice is to log in via Facebook. And to give you another example, a few months ago, I wanted to buy inox screws that I found on a platform or a website somewhere in France, and I had to log in via Facebook to be able to place an order of 20 euro for inox screws. And so we believe that the DSA is the opportunity to introduce a mandatory European single sign-on, and so that we would not, in fact, provide all this information we provide on login to the dominant players. Next slide, please. Ex-ante dedicated rules. So, of course, in the house that we are now today, I think it's something that they know very well, because it's their reasons to exist, and in fact it's also why their independence is guaranteed in the framework. But I would say that's why, in fact, we would certainly welcome those tools. And as we said, in our sector, so in the European communication services sector, in the electronic communication sector, the ex-ante regulation framework has proven to be efficient to foster competition and contestability. There are still issues, I come to that, but there is a track record of some achievements. Then we would say that the experience with the ex-ante approach and expertise gained with the European SMP framework for electronic communication could certainly serve as a good basis. Also remembering that this framework has evolved, and we started from the open network provision, then moved to the SMP, and now with the new code, we have somehow weakened a little bit this regime. But there are some fundamental differences and some important questions remains, because the regulatory framework is based on the first point, the market definition. So what are the products or services that you include in one specific market? Once you have defined your market, you look at if you can find a significant market power. And then in the ECS, problems begin if you would have oligopolistic non-competitive outcomes, for example. There it's already much more complicated. And then finally, if you have found SMP, you impose remedies that you hope will solve the market failure that you identified. And to do the market, the product market definition, the regulators have to do the hypothetical monopoly test. So they do the theoretical exercise by thinking that what would be the result of a small but significant non-transitory increase in price, so the well-known as SNP test. Now the challenge on platform is that you have a two-sided market, and in telecom, when you do a SNP test, it's directly the increase in price go to your customers. Here, you could say, okay, how do you ventilate that, and what's the impact? So that just to illustrate, because there are other examples. And BEREC make the proposal of the significant intermediary power, so the SIP. So that's also probably a good idea. But and the professor listed some of the criteria. So on our side, we would say the criteria that on the behavioral are also quite important. So I think here defining precise and important criteria would be of the essence. So, for example, does the platform restrict choices for additional services, or is it in such a way bundling its own services or applications? Is there an equal or unequal treatment with competing services, and so on? And so there are many of those kind of criteria that could be applied. But we see already that although there is similarities and the SMP regime can be a good basis, there is still lots of differences, and there needs to be a significant reflection on that. Also knowing that SMP regulation is not a simple task. So you have the regulatory framework, then you have quite important guidelines, so that known as the SMP guidelines, and then you have the recommendation on relevant markets, and then you have BEREC guidelines. So it's quite complex, and then we can also think, does this complexity achieve the homogeneous or the fact that within the different jurisdictions in Europe we achieved similar results. Then a last point, that to avoid legal uncertainty, by-then criteria should be defined for the platform subject to regulation. So it's a little bit the same point as before. So the criteria need to be well defined and binding. Next slide, please. Voilà. Then, as I said, we are in the house of where I think in people that are connected to this workshop, there is. I don't think that you probably would find more expertise on how to do a market analysis in a multidisciplinary way. So, as the professor said, you need legal people, economists, all kind of skills. But let's be a little bit critical on that. And certainly from our perspective, where we see what happens in the 27 jurisdictions, and sometimes you can give good points, and sometimes you think that's not the way we want it to happen. And then let's then first say, okay, before saying do we need a specific regulatory authority or we would manage that, I would say let's first see on what are the new powers and the instruments. Because let's put it in the right way. Let's first define what can happen, and then have a debate how it needs to be organized. Okay? It's like strategy. When you define the strategy, you first decide the strategy, and then you look at the organization to implement the strategy, not the other way around. And here it's the same. Then we would say that the regulatory oversight, both at EU and national level, but we would say that's probably a good way, because as we said, it would be important that you have harmonization between the different member states. And if we also would see what happens on the telecom sector, you already do have those kinds of mechanisms. So that's probably something that will be needed, a mechanism to have a collaboration between a EU level and probably at the member state level. But what is important, and then it's where I come to the final points on this slide, is let's make sure that we don't have a kind of game of throwing the ball back and force between the EU and the national level, because that's a little bit what happens already in the electronic communication sector. And let's look at what lesson can be learned from the electronic communication services regulatory framework. The first one, I would say, and it's related to questions that were asked in the very beginning. Independency goes with transparency. And so if we look today in the mechanism that is foreseen to have this coordination between the national level and the European level when regulating electronic communications, under still today Article 7 procedures, and when the European Commission is asking advices to BERECs, for example, it's not transparent. Stakeholders cannot give input. And you can say that is the matter of time. And that, Michel, I agree with you. And that's a comment we have made. Time should be just make longer. We cannot get that as excuse. Because transparency and the possibility to involve stakeholders is fundamental. Then the second point that we see, what happens if the regulatory authority is not performing as it should? Okay. And again, I give the example in comparison with the list of relevant markets, because in the list of relevant markets, what we see is that they are reduced and reduced and reduced. And then when the market is taken away from the list, of course, the regulator, the national regulatory authority can still decide to regulate the market, but he has to do it. And if they are market failure, what happens if the regulator is lazy and is not doing it? And then you could say, okay, there is competition law, but it's a little bit contradictory, because if you pass the 3 criteria test, then competition alone should not solve it. So, and that's what we see in some of the market. And to give you an example, for example, on the German market and the mobile German market, there are huge issues, and where players are complaining to the European Commission, they send back the people to Venezia. And so it's a kind of circle that is not broken. And so the main question to that.
Can I, sorry to interrupt, but can you wrap up quickly, because
yeah,
we need to have time for the final speaker.
I finish, Matthew. And so the key point is, where is the accountability? And so before deciding how to put that, we need to really solve the problem of the accountability. Next slide, please. Voila. So the accountability of the regulatory must be strong and clearly defined. And so to conclude, I would say independency goes with transparency and accountability. And you cannot dissociate those three. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luc. I will quickly move on to the next speaker. This is for Etno. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon to everyone, and a big thank you to BEREC for inviting Etno to the Stakeholder Forum. We really appreciate BEREC's effort in these difficult times to actually engage with the stakeholders. And the topic of this panel is extremely important for us, promoting a fair, future-oriented regulatory climate that will boost investment and innovation in digital services. That has always been one of ETNO's defining goals. So today we have so many people relying on connectivity as their lifeline. And it should be clear for all that investment in rollout is not really a buzzword any longer. It's a top political priority to get our economies up and running. And in this context, ETNO has been a long advocate for the so-called level playing field in the digital value chain. Sometimes this term has been portrayed as an emblem of a parochial clash between the European telecom operators and the OTTs. But it has become very, very clear that while the world is going more and more online and digital products are becoming an important part of our daily life, it is actually key parts of this environment is concentrating in the hands of a few large multinational. I can give you a bit of numbers here. If we look at the engine market, the search engine market, it's have one player with 90% share. When it comes to smartphones and the app economy, the top two players jointly possess 99% of the global mobile operating system market. And if we look at cloud infrastructure, the combined market share over two market leaders are over 50%. And we could go on these numbers. And these mega platforms, they have the ability to set the rules of the game in the digital ecosystem. We've talked about this before. And they can act as gatekeepers, both for businesses and consumers, and they're able to stifle, if they want, competition and choice in the market. And this also affects the telecommunication market, where these players are accelerating the disintermediation of telecom operators. So this trend will actually only increase with 5G, where some of the players are moving towards the edge to leverage their storage, but also analytic capabilities. And in software-defined networks, as we're talking about, this could entrench their grip over key parts of the infrastructure and over telecom users dramatically. So I'm very glad that BEREC is aware of these developments, and they will investigate the competitive dynamics into the internet value chain over the next year. And for me, this topic is not only about businesses, it's about the role and responsibility of digital services and their consequences in democratic societies. And it's about breaking the dependency on a few large digital players and to assert a European way on how digital markets are governed. And this is what the vision of the level playing field tagline always has been about. We now have the opportunity to shape the rules of the game for the digital sectors for the years to come. And I would like to add one thing. We should not believe those who tell us that this is mainly about protectionism. It is not. We know that the same debates are taking headlines also in the DC, and we also heard what Professor William Kovacic was telling us. It's about a debate that needs to go into both societies. And it has been profusely discussed also in this panel, the opportunities offered by upcoming landmark initiatives, introducing ex-ante rules for digital gatekeepers, as well as new market investigation powers at EU level. So let me be very brief and get straight to ETNO's view on the DSA and the competition reform. We support a new ex-ante regulatory framework that solves problems from entrenched dominance in digital markets. And this framework should be carefully tailored to large online gatekeepers. It's identified based on relevant criteria that reflect the competitive dynamics of the digital markets. And digital environment that are particularly concerning in terms of gatekeeping and anti-competitive effects are operating systems, that's online advertising, that's voice assistant, and it's also cloud computing. So we advocate for a case-by-case approach with the application of tailored remedies that are most appropriate to address abusive practices, preserve contestability, and promote consumer choice. And proportionality will be key in reflecting the nature and the gravity of specific competition problems in a targeted market. So we find that a list of prohibited practices that gatekeepers should always be prevented from employing, that can offer a complementary safeguard against basic abusive behaviors. But a static blacklist would not be enough to guarantee fair competition in continuously evolving digital systems. It is only valuable as a complement to the case-by-case framework, allowing for tailor-made remedies for individual gatekeepers. And finally, enforcement of new rules should be handled at the EU level, since large platforms in global ecosystems and competitive concerns have an important cross-border dimension. And still, as the effects of platforms abusive conduct may differ across national markets, coordination of national competent authorities remains crucial. So in conclusion, I believe that EU is about to embark on what we could be one of the most relevant tech policy exercise of our generation, which could inspire a new global approach to digital markets. As ETNO, we're giving full support for European decision makers to make this effort a success story. And I'll stop here and look forward to discussions during Q&A. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, excellent overview. And I want to thank the panel and thank BEREC for raising all these very important issues. And also to Professor Kovacic for introducing us to these complex issues. We don't have a lot of time. We do have some questions that have already been raised by you, the panelists. And we're also looking forward to some questions from the audience. So far, there are none at the moment. So I'm going to just launch into the first question that I've come up with. And since we are here at a BEREC conference and you have the opinion of BEREC from the on the DSA, which hopefully everyone has reviewed, there's some really interesting ideas in there, and it's essentially talking about who the new regulator should be. Professor Kovacic has brought this up. He even said that a good model would be the Dutch ACM, where you have a competition and a consumer regulator merged into one. So I would like to put this out to the audience, to the panel. How should the DSA actually impose some of these ex-ante regulations in terms of making sure that large platforms do actually follow these new rules, and so that there's more harmonized imposition of enforcement. Could that be through BEREC? Should it be through a new unit in the Commission, or should it be through the competition authorities? So anyone want to grab that one as a first question? I'll leave that up to you. To anyone who wants to raise their hand. Luke, I saw your hand go up. If you want, go ahead.
Yeah, but if anyone else want to answer, because I already covered that somehow in my presentation. So we would say, for us, let's first define what are the new tools and what are the powers, and then define how to organize it. So let's not do it the other way around. But prima facie, if you would think that there is a need for a European level, and so the European Commission should certainly play a role in that. And depending on the cases and so on, that there would be probably a role also for professional members. But there is one thing very important, and when we consolidate, is that we need to avoid, I would say, waterbed effects, certainly when you compete for resources. And the more competences you put together in one regulator, we need to make sure that they can continue to do their existing activities. And for us, it is of utmost importance that NRAs continue to do and to put sufficient attention to the regulation of electronic communication services, because there remain many, many issues. And so that's a priority for us. Thank you.
Excellent. I think Benedict, you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to add. I mean, I see it quite similar to Luc when it comes to the enforcement, in that we first want to clarify what this is supposed to be done and how, and then we, the secondary question would be in what structure. And I think there's a few steps back we should be taking first, as to establishing kind of the type of, whether there's a market failure and all of that before going to the type of enforcement.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the first step of any of these analysis is the market definition, and if there is a problem. So Ursula, you raised your hand there.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to very briefly answer to the enforcement governance question. From our point of view, when it comes to the ex ante regulatory framework, because that will be a cross-border element by nature, we think the Commission is probably best placed to deal with it. The problem being if it is the national authorities and working together probably in a network and taking joint positions. I think we haven't yet seen the ideal concept. We see the GDPR, but there we have the problem. I would say that the idea is that it's the authority where the trader or the company is established, so the country of origin regime for defining the authority, that is problematic. We have the CPC, the Consumer Authorities Network, which is something new, which we will see how it operates. But when it comes to this gatekeeper regulatory framework, I think the Commission is best placed, and that could be an interdisciplinary task force within the Commission. And what would be really important is a very close cooperation with the networks that are relevant, and BEREC obviously first of all, but maybe also the data protection authorities and the EDPB and maybe the consumer authorities. So that would be our guess how this should look like. Thank you.
Sounds some good ideas there. I just want to go back to one thing you said earlier, and you raised one of your big points was about the liability rules, and so there was some discussion about whether or not the current rules about giving the protection to the platforms should be maintained. If you look at some of the drafts that have come out from the European Commission, they seem to have that locked in as they're not moving on that, and also the country of origin is to be protected. But it does raise a question that comes up a lot, and it's about how do you organize the policing of content. So there's this balance between disinformation, hate speech, illegal content, but also the freedom of expression issues. What should the Commission do about making sure that you maintain innovation, freedom of expression, but also have tougher rules on platforms about content moderation? So it's not just currently a voluntary exercise by these platforms.
Yes. Okay. I'm connected. Good. Thank you.
Do you
Hello,
ask
Roberto.
me, Matthew?
Yes, if you want to start, Ursula,
Yeah,
and then we can move
I'll
on
be
to the
very
other
brief
panelists.
because I hear Roberto is already in a waiting position. I mean, what is the liability of the platform? I think that's a crucial question, and I would like, if you allow, Matthew, to expand your question a little bit, because it's not only about fake news and disinformation and illegal content like hate speech. From a consumer perspective, it's also about commercial content, if I can name it like that. That means listings of products that are dangerous and not compliant with European standards, or fake ads or scams, as I mentioned, which was a huge problem, particularly during the COVID lockdown. So what we are asking for is that in specific circumstances, there is that the platform becomes liable, and so we don't question the principle that there is an exemption from liability unless you have actual knowledge. Only then you have to act expeditiously. But we want to clarify what does that mean, and we want to link it to concrete damages, because that damage compensation, because that has not been harmonized by the e-commerce directive. So we're saying that if you have evidence, and clear evidence and credible evidence, that there is an illegal activity on your platform and you do not act in an appropriate manner, you become liable towards the consumer for the damages that have occurred due to your non-activity. So that's one element. Another element that we would like to see changed is that platforms that have a economically dominant position towards the trader, towards the commercial user, that, for example, they control the payments, they control the presentation of the offer, or other elements, like they give the infrastructure to the trader, then they should become liable. So a more nuanced liability that is not contrary to the principle, but is more specific and more harmonized when it comes to damages compensation. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I really wish we could continue this, and if we had a cocktail, then we could chat over that, but unfortunately, we're unable to do that. I'm just going to very quickly introduce our final speaker for today, Roberto Viola. I think many of you have met him in person, and it's too bad we can't see him more often. He is the Director General of DG Connect. He was the Deputy Director General of DG Connect from 2012 to 2015. He also served as Chairman of the European Radio Spectrum Policy Group from 2012 to 2013, and Deputy Chairman in 2011 and Chairman in 2010. And he was a member of the BEREC board and Chairman of the European Regulators Group. So, Roberto, thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to your speaking today.
Thank you very much. First of all, I really congratulate BEREC and the organization for being able to run this forum completely virtually. It's a pity, but that's life. So our life is going to be, in the weeks to come, in the months to come, still to deal with the pandemic, and having telecom networks, platform, digital services really at the center of running the society in a smooth and safe way. So the discussions we are having is essential when we look at the, let's call it the new normal, or whatever you want to call it. And there are aspects which are really at the core of the responsibility of BEREC, like, having safe, reliable, cheap connectivity available to all citizens, which are also the core of the action of the European Commission when it comes to the recovery of Europe. As you know, our president has suggested that 20% of the funds of the recovery fund will go to digital. And actually the leaders, the member states, the heads of states of government on the 2nd of October decided that indeed this invitation should be actually supported, and it will become a legal requirement. That means that we will invest in the future of Europe in the main two strands, which is green and digital. And this will be the majority of the funds. Over 57% of the funds will go to this twin transformation. In particular, digital, we will invest in 4 flagships. Connectivity, as I said, important. I think everyone is a bit frustrated about every now and then having a connectivity experience which is not up to what is expected. I think all our way of offering connectivity is something that was considered for a long time important, but maybe not so important. When you think, for instance, about how we charge connectivity on mobile phones, now the new normal probably is going to be different. I mean, we will need more and more plans for always-on connectivity. But at the same time, of course, we have to deal with network congestion. That's why new frequencies are so important, and the next generation of mobile phones with 5G is very important. So connectivity is a big flagship. The second one is people, so skills, more skills for our society, more, possibility for the young people to find a job. There are many jobs without young people and vice versa, many young people without jobs. Third element is scaling up technology, the possibility to use data, to use computing, to really, transform every service and every product with the digital technologies. And the fourth one, which is also very important, is to change our administration from the health system, from the public systems. I think all of you, including myself, have been frustrated at times to deal with an administration that is trying to offer services at distance, but those services are not coming because the administration is not yet digital. So these are the 5 flagships, and you can rest reassured that we are working intensively with the member states and make sure that every recovery plan would really have these 5 flagships as the core part when it comes to spending the 20% in digital transformation. But of course, alongside this, there's an issue about the rules. The rules that need to be clear, need to be predictable, and need to be put everybody on the same level playing field when it comes to offering digital services. And this is the other important asset that we would like to bring to the table for a solid, stable recovery from this crisis and a new normal, to have clarity about the rules around digital services. In many respects, in the respect of, I heard the tale of the previous panel about the responsibility of platforms, and I will comment in a second on this, but also about the new cybersecurity rules that need to be followed by every sector, the new rules, to empower data sharing among companies, citizens, public services, so what we call the data governance. The rules about making sure that every citizen can use digital identity, and this digital identity actually is recognized by every service. The rules about data generation, who should be owner of the data that are generated, what are the rules to engage in such a generation. The rules about safety of artificial intelligence-based products and services. So what can be considered, things that need to be done, especially to enable new services to be developed, but to limit the risks in terms of artificial intelligence. And on top of this, the European Council has asked the Commission to come also what is the vision in the next 10 years. So where our society will go in terms of the next challenges. And this is being this Stakeholder Forum, something we want to discuss with every stakeholder and make sure that then we will formulate the long-term horizon of where Europe wants to go. It should be clear. So I think all in all, Europe has been always considered strong for its standard setting, rule setting, but now with the recovery plan, with the new financial framework, I think also we become very serious when it comes to investing in digital. It's a unique opportunity for the citizens, for the companies, for the public administrations that we need to seize all together. So I understand that this year the BEREC Forum has very much discussed about the issue of platforms. As I was saying, this is one of the issues which is part of the rule book, the new rule book that we want to present by the end of the year. And we will concentrate in two areas. The first area, which we called as a not God's name, but code name, is the Digital Service Act. And the second area is about the fairness of operating in the digital markets. So the first part, many things have been said, and there's been a public consultation. And I can reassure you, because I was again hearing a little bit, that when looking at digital services, I mean, there are many things. I mean, there are content-related services, but at the same time, there are also services which are about selling physical goods or offering services which are not necessarily digital. So the responsibility of platforms is something that is multifaceted and doesn't stop to one type or the other. At the same time, we should, as much as possible, avoid to have too many sector-specific legislation, avoid to have too much of, micromanagement of a certain thing, but really to make sure that we have clear horizontal rules. So when it comes to responsibility, liability, when it comes to which kind of regulatory system should guarantee the oversight, we need answers which are clear. Now, for instance, one clear asset of the regulation of platforms so far has been the so-called country of origin. So the fact that a platform can be established in one of the member states in Europe and offer service everywhere. This is a fundamental element if you want also European platforms to scale up. I mean, the basic principle of the internal market is this concept that you establish somewhere and you can offer it inside the internal market. And this is really one of the treasures of the internal market. It would be really a pity to lose it. And this is not clearly the intention of the Commission. But we want to make sure that the country of origin for platforms, it's Europe. That means that the rules must be the same everywhere. That citizens which are not resident in the country of origin are equally guaranteed that the citizens that are working and or are resident in the country of origin. That it is clear that if something, cannot be offered because it's contrary to EU law when it comes to a product, then it cannot be offered everywhere. It is clear that if a citizen has to complain about the service, he cannot travel to the country of origin to file a complaint. So we need to make sure that, first of all, we have harmonization of rules. Secondly, that we have a good regulatory system that is based on cooperation. And for sure, we have successful examples of cooperation. And of course, the first that I like to highlight is BEREC. BEREC is a successful example of cooperation of the telecom regulators. There are other networks where the cooperation is very strong. Let's think about the financial regulators, let's think about the privacy regulators, and if you like, the new kid in the block, which is the cooperation among the content regulators, which was introduced by the AVMSD. These are good systems, and whatever we will present in terms of the Digital Service Act will not replace these cooperation networks and will not, touch sectorial rules, but will make sure that all of these can work in a coordinated fashion, because sometimes the issue is about products, sometimes it's about content, sometimes it's about the service. So we need the necessary glue to keep the system together, to make sure that, the country of origin works, but works in the European sense. And we need to make sure that there's a regulatory oversight that is valid for all over Europe. So that's the main ingredient when it comes to country of origin. When it comes to the issue of liability, of course, I mean, we need to make sure that what is the basic rule of liability, which is introduced in the e-commerce directive, is not turned upside down, because no one can actually check every single line of blog post or video or whatever. But there are different mechanisms. Already the FMSD introduces the concept of, for instance, co-regulation, the concept of terms and conditions, the notion of regulators working together. So there are mechanisms by which the overall principle of liability can be declined in very precise way of looking at those things. Now, I will frustrate you because I will not tell you much about what we are doing, and you will understand that, I mean, nothing is decided until everything is decided. So when the Commission will present a DSA, everything will be clear. Now we are still evaluating thousands of replies in the public consultation, and it would be not a sign of respect from those of you that posted the many important comments and ideas that now I'll start to say this is right, this is wrong, or this is the decision of the Commission, because the Commission has not yet made its final decision. So, but you can be reassured that things like country of origin, liability, issues about product and services, issues about regulatory cooperation, they're all part of the things we are looking right now in terms of finalizing the Digital Service Act proposal that we'll present by the end of the year. The twin proposal will be about looking at the power, the market power of platforms and the dynamic which is around the digital market, which is very peculiar. These are markets, for those of you that fancy, I mean, a bit more detail, the so-called, I mean, markets which have different dimensions, markets that you have customers on one front, you have the business on the other fronts, you might have multiple types of business. And this makes, I mean, the economic evaluation of the dynamics in this market particularly interesting and particularly complicated. These are markets where, I mean, the existence of large platforms or oligopolies is relatively common because of, I mean, the winner takes it all, the network effects, all the things you know very well. So in this multidimensional space, of course, there's a bit the question we have posed during the public consultation, whether we should have some form of ex-ante regulation of certain behaviors. As you might remember, I'm sure you remember, we have now entered into force a regulation on fair behavior of platforms when it comes to business to business. So this is something that is based, these are horizontal rules, transparency rules which are valid for all the sector when it comes to business transactions. Now the next question which we'll examine is whether there's the need for some asymmetric rules. And once again, a bit frustrating, I mean, some expectation, I will not say much for the time being because we are still reading, I mean, as for DSA, the enormous amount of contributions. But of course, the question is on the table, whether there are similarities with other parts of the regulation, for instance, on network industries, where there are not similarities, whether we should go for the identification of certain elements that make then the need for ex-ante rules in order to maximize the benefit for business and consumers. As for the Digital Service Act, our intention is to present something by the end of the year. So in summary, I think you should not look at one thing that is being done, because one thing is part of a broader picture. I think the broader picture is Digital transformation is one of the imperative, one of the assets of Europe to fight and exit this pandemic, and then to have a solid economic and social growth in the so-called new normal. It cannot be just rules, cannot be just funding, it's a bit of a mix of everything, and it's a long-term project. So that's the way to look at the approach we are taking. And the other thing being this stakeholder forum, nothing can be done against what the stakeholders indicate. This would be a fatal mistake, which we hope we will never make. That's why all of this, it's based on rooted of extensive consultation with stakeholders. And forum like this should continue, and I'm sure in the coming weeks, when we will see the recovery plan entering much more into implementation, and on the regulatory side, the proposal for the Digital Service Act, whatever we will propose about the market force of when it comes to the digital economy, these kind of things will need, of course, we will need first of all a democratic debate with the two co-legislator, but they will, of course, continue to be in need of a very extensive stakeholder dialogue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Roberto Viola. That was fascinating to hear a little bit of a hint about where we're going with the DSA, and we're going to be glued to our screens on the 2nd of December when the Commission will release the big package, and then we'll have, well, could be 18 months, 2 years, 3 years of debate. So now we're close to wrapping up for today. I want to thank you for your attention. I'm going to pass the floor to Michel for some final words, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'd like to start by thanking all the speakers of today and the people of the BEREC office who made this event happen. Our thanks must also go to our two moderators, Matthew from MLEX and Philippe from Cullen International, and to the ACM, BTS and BIPT's teams as well. BEREC organized a webinar on 1st April this year, and in which it presented its strategic priorities for the years 2021-2025. And we were happy to see such a high early engagement from you on the development of the BEREC working program for next year. And again, today, I really appreciate your interactions, even though virtual, and the question related to our activities. The questions provide valuable feedback on BEREC's work that we take back to our office. One of the things I would like to take away from your questions and remarks today is that stakeholders appreciate our work on the 5G radar. However, there is a big call to eliminate a regulatory burden to deploy 5G, and the same goes for fiber infrastructure, of course. During its introduction, Commissioner Breton was very clear about what needs to be done. Accelerate fiber deployment and the rollout of 5G networks. These investments will happen in a backdrop of the new electronic communication code that will kick into effect in Europe by the end of this year, as you know. And as Commissioner Breton said, to mobilize investment, we need an efficient system, harmonized rules in Europe. Well, I can assure you as an incoming BEREC chair that I will do everything in my capacity to ensure Our overall objective being a consistent application of the regulatory framework in electronic communications is reached. BEREC will contribute through cooperation with the competent institutions and stakeholders to ensure that future network technology meets their connectivity targets in line with European values and interests, being security, protection of the end users, environmental challenges, and so on, and this all fit for a digital age. In 2021, monitoring the impact of the code will be at the forefront of BEREC's works, and much of our work will shift from providing guidelines toward assessing future technological and market developments related to end users' provisions within the scope of electronic communications and the digital ecosystem in particular. Ladies and gentlemen, the Digital Services Act, the new rulebook, will be a major game changer for Europe and for the rest of the world, for players who seem to be too big to care. From Professor Kovacic, we've heard that a dedicated tool is to be put in place because competition law is insufficient and there are other related aspects, data, consumers, ex-ante regulations, and so on. He also raised many questions we need to reflect on. There are many takeaways of the panels too. DSA is a top priority. We need to prevent, not to cure, and to reward success. It is not about protectionism in Europe. Independence requires also transparency and accountability, and many others. As mentioned during the panel debate, the governance model of the DSA will not be a walk in the park, but requires strong coordination between institutions and the member states, and the European level, a multi-layer model as Commissioner Breton described it. In this slide, let me refer to our opinion on the DSA published last month. We, in BEREC, aim to continue to contribute to the regulatory debate on digital platforms, to further refine the details of ex-ante regulating of digital platforms. We want to continue to work with the European institutions and other relevant stakeholders on this topic. With this, it's time to wrap up today's session. We hope to greet you soon in the next Stakeholder Forum in April and continue fruitful interactions during consultations, public debriefing, and maybe most importantly, in workshops. Thanks for being with us. I wish you a good evening.